I used to think discipline was a simple equation. A child misbehaves, you apply pressure, and you get correction. Clean, direct, almost mathematical. That was the world I was taught to believe in. But over the years, watching children grow, listening to parents argue, observing teenagers who smile politely at home and behave like strangers outside, I started noticing something uncomfortable. Some of the best behaved children weren't really disciplined at all. They were trained to avoid consequences, not understand behavior, and the moment the pressure was gone, so was the behavior. That's when a question began to sit quietly in my mind. What if punishment isn't actually teaching children to be good, but only teaching them how to avoid getting caught? Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I'm not talking about chaos or children running wild with no structure. Children absolutely need boundaries. But there's a difference between shaping a child's character and controlling their behavior through fear. And honestly, this is where most parents get stuck, because punishment feels effective. It works fast. It shuts things down immediately. But the results, real results, tend to show up much later, and not always in ways parents expect. So the real question isn't whether children should be disciplined. The question is whether we're raising children who behave because they understand or because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. And that's where this conversation begins. Punishment feels effective because it gives immediate feedback. A child does something wrong, and within seconds there is a reaction: scolding, withdrawal of privileges, sometimes even physical discipline in more traditional homes. The parent feels a sense of control returning to the room. Order is restored, at least on the surface. But psychology tells a more complicated story underneath that surface. What is actually happening in that moment is a form of operant conditioning. The child learns that a certain behavior leads to an unpleasant outcome, so they reduce that behavior in the presence of the authority figure. It looks like learning, it looks like maturity, but often it is simply avoidance learning. And avoidance is not the same as understanding. I remember observing something very consistent over time. A child who is very obedient at home, almost overly careful, sometimes becomes completely different outside the home. At school, at a friend's house, or when unsupervised, the same child may experiment with the exact behaviors they were strictly forbidden from doing. Not necessarily out of rebellion, but because the internal reasoning was never built. Only the fear of consequence was. Punishment trains the brain to ask one primary question: will I get in trouble? Not, is this right or wrong? Not, how does this affect others? That shift is subtle, but it is everything. And the irony is that punishment can actually increase secrecy. A child who fears consequences too much becomes better at hiding behavior, not necessarily improving it. They learn timing, silence, and disguise, not morality. There is also something deeper happening emotionally. When punishment is frequent or intense, children often begin to associate mistakes with emotional danger rather than learning opportunities. Instead of thinking, I made a mistake and can fix it, they start thinking, I am in trouble again. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because over time, repeated exposure to this cycle can shape either shame or detachment. Some children internalize shame and become overly self-critical. Others detach emotionally and stop caring about correction altogether because the process feels humiliating rather than helpful. And here is the part many adults miss. The goal of discipline is not immediate silence or compliance. It is long-term self-regulation. A child who only behaves when watched is not disciplined. They are supervised. So the question slowly begins to shift. If punishment produces compliance in the moment, but does not reliably produce understanding, then what exactly are children learning, and what are they carrying into adulthood? When you start looking closely at children who are frequently punished, a pattern begins to emerge that is both subtle and consistent. They don't just learn what not to do, they learn what not to admit. And that changes everything about development. A child who grows up under repeated punishment often becomes highly skilled at reading authority. They learn tone, timing, facial expression, and emotional temperature. They become experts at predicting reactions. On the surface, this can look like maturity, but underneath it, something else is forming, behavior shaped around survival rather than understanding. One of the most overlooked psychological shifts here is the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. Punishment, especially when it is frequent or emotionally charged, tends to blur that line. Instead of separating behavior from identity, the child starts fusing the two. So instead of thinking, I shouldn't have lied, they begin to think, I am the kind of person who gets into trouble. And once that identity forms, correction becomes emotionally loaded. The child is no longer just adjusting behavior, they are defending self image. This is where you start seeing two common outcomes. Some children become overly compliant. They avoid risk, avoid mistakes, and avoid anything that might trigger correction. They become what many adults describe as easy children. But often they struggle with confidence, decision making, and emotional independence later in life because they were trained to follow rules, not evaluate situations. Other children go in the opposite direction. They resist, hide, or emotionally disconnect, not because they lack morals, but because repeated punishment has made the experience of correction feel like an attack rather than guidance. So instead of opening up, they shut down. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth many parents eventually have to face. Punishment does not automatically build responsibility. It often builds response management, meaning the child is not thinking about what is right, they are thinking about what is safe. And that distinction is critical when we talk about long term character, because character is not built in moments of fear. It is built in moments of fear, understanding, and repeated guided choice, which leads to the next question that naturally follows. If punishment is not the foundation of true discipline, then what actually is? This is where most people assume the argument is heading toward no discipline at all. But that's not what is happening in reality, and it's also not what works in practice. Removing punishment does not mean removing structure. It simply changes the mechanism of correction. Instead of fear based control, the foundation becomes consequence based learning and emotional coaching. Now, there is an important distinction here that often gets ignored. Children are not born with fully developed impulse control. The part of the brain responsible for long term thinking and self regulation is still developing well into adolescence. So, expecting consistent rational behavior without guidance is unrealistic. But what they can develop early is pattern recognition, understanding that actions have predictable outcomes. For example, instead of, you are punished for not doing your homework, the focus shifts to a logical consequence. You don't complete your homework, so you experience the result of unpreparedness at school. The adult doesn't become the source of emotional threat. Reality becomes the teacher. This is where natural and logical consequences become powerful tools. Natural consequences are what happen without interference. A child forgets their lunch, they experience hunger. A child ignores studying, they experience difficulty in a test. These experiences, when safe, teach cause and effect more effectively than imposed punishment. Logical consequences are structured responses that are directly connected to the behavior. Not random penalties, not emotional reactions, but predictable outcomes that help the child link action to responsibility. But here's the part that often determines whether this approach works or fails: communication. Without explanation, consequences can still feel like punishment. The difference is not just what happens, but how it is framed. The child needs to understand why the consequence exists and what lesson it is meant to reinforce. And alongside consequences comes something even more important: emotional regulation from the adult. Because children do not only learn from what is said, They learn from the emotional state of the person correcting them. Calm correction teaches stability. Explosive correction teaches threat response. This is also where repetition and consistency matter more than intensity. One calm, consistent message repeated over time shapes behavior far more effectively than occasional extreme reactions. And slowly, something begins to change in the child's internal world. Instead of asking, "How do I avoid getting into trouble?" they begin to ask, "What happens when I make this choice?" And eventually, "What choice makes the most sense here?" That shift from external control to internal reasoning is the beginning of real discipline. But even then, one question remains. How exactly does a child move from understanding consequences to actually developing self discipline that holds up even when no one is watching? This is where the real work of parenting begins, not in controlling behavior, but in building internal structure. Self discipline is not something you install in a child through pressure. It develops gradually through repeated experiences where the child is allowed to think, choose, fail safely, and reflect. And that word, reflection, is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. A child who is constantly punished rarely gets space to reflect. The moment something goes wrong, the emotional energy shifts to the adult's reaction. The focus becomes managing consequences, not understanding decisions. But when correction is calm and structured, something different happens. The child is able to stay in the learning process long enough to actually process it. One of the most important psychological foundations here is autonomy. Children who are given appropriate levels of choice, small age appropriate decisions, begin to develop a sense of ownership over outcomes. Even simple things matter. Choosing when to complete a task within a time window, selecting between two acceptable options, or deciding how to solve a problem with guidance rather than instructions, all of these build decision making muscles. And those muscles are what later become self discipline. Because discipline is not obedience. Discipline is the ability to act in alignment with a goal, even when no one is enforcing it. There is also another critical factor: emotional safety. A child cannot think clearly when they feel threatened. When the nervous system is in stress mode, the brain prioritizes survival over reasoning. That means harsh reactions don't just affect behavior in the moment, they temporarily reduce the child's ability to learn from the situation at all. This is why some corrections feel like they go in one ear and out the other. It's not stubbornness in many cases, it's overload. Now, when children grow in an environment where mistakes are corrected without emotional threat, something subtle but powerful happens over time. They begin to internalize the correction process. They start correcting themselves before external intervention is even needed. You see it in small moments first. A child pauses before acting. They reconsider choices out loud. They begin to anticipate outcomes not because they are afraid, but because honesty no longer automatically leads to emotional punishment. Correction becomes something they can survive, not something they must avoid. On a practical level, it simply looks like a child who starts to catch themselves. And perhaps the most interesting shift is this: they begin to tell the truth more easily. Not because they are forced to, but because honesty no longer automatically leads to emotional punishment. Correction becomes something they can survive, not something they must avoid. Over time, this builds a very different kind of adult in the making. Someone who doesn't just follow rules, but understands consequences, evaluates choices, and regulates themselves even in the absence of authority. But of course, this approach sounds ideal in theory. In real life, it is far more emotionally demanding for the parent, and that is exactly where most people struggle the most. This is the part nobody really warns parents about. The hardest challenge in raising disciplined children without punishment is not the child, it's the adult's own instincts. Because punishment is fast, it gives immediate emotional relief. A child misbehaves, you react, the situation stops. There is closure. The nervous system settles quickly. But teaching instead of punishing is slower, messier, and often emotionally louder in a different way. It requires staying present in a moment that feels like it is spiraling without reaching for the quickest control button. And that is where many parents feel tested. One of the biggest internal battles is the belief system most adults grew up with. If I don't react strongly, the child won't take me seriously. This belief is powerful because it is rooted in personal experience. Many adults were raised in environments where authority was enforced through fear, so calm correction can initially feel like weakness, even when it is actually strength. There is also exhaustion, real exhaustion, repeating explanations, restating boundaries, watching a child test limits again and again while resisting the urge to escalate emotionally. It can feel like nothing is working in the moment, but development doesn't show itself in moments. It shows itself in patterns over time. Another difficulty is consistency. It is easy to stay calm once. It is much harder to stay consistent when the same behavior happens for the 10th time in different forms. This is where emotional discipline in the parent becomes just as important as discipline in the child, because children are incredibly sensitive to inconsistency. If one day a behavior is calmly corrected and another day it is met with anger, the child does not just learn the rule, they learn unpredictability. And unpredictability often leads to anxiety or testing behavior, not stability. There is also something more subtle happening in the background. Parents are often carrying their own unresolved emotional reactions to misbehavior. A child's actions can unconsciously trigger memories of disrespect, fear of losing control, or concern about judgment from others. And when those emotions take over, reaction replaces guidance. This is why this approach demands something deeper than technique. It demands emotional regulation from the adult side. Not perfection, just awareness and repair when needed. Because even calm parenting is not about never reacting emotionally. It is about returning to balance and correcting the interaction when it goes off course. And over time, something begins to shift in the household dynamic. The child stops fearing correction, the parent stops escalating for control, and discipline becomes less about conflict and more about guidance. But the most important realization that often emerges at this stage is this: children do not actually need harsh control to develop strong character. What they need is consistent structure, emotional safety, and repeated opportunities to connect actions with outcomes, which brings the entire conversation to a final reflection. What kind of adults are we truly shaping when we choose understanding over fear? When you strip everything down, parenting is not really about controlling behavior in the moment. It is about shaping the kind of decision maker a child becomes over time. Punishment can stop actions quickly, yes, but what we've walked through today is something deeper. Stopping a behavior is not the same as building judgment. One creates compliance, the other creates character. And character is what survives when rules, supervision, and authority are no longer in the room. What stands out most in this approach is not that children are left without boundaries, far from it. Boundaries are very present. But instead of fear being the engine, understanding becomes the guide. Consequences still exist, correction still happens, expectations are still clear. The difference is that the child is being trained to think through behavior, not just avoid punishment. Over time, that produces a very different kind of maturity, one that doesn't depend on external pressure to function properly. And maybe the most honest takeaway here is this: raising children without punishment is less about finding the perfect method and more about developing a consistent mindset, one that values teaching over reacting and long term growth over short term control. Now, I genuinely like to hear from you. Have you noticed situations where punishment changed behavior temporarily but didn't really solve the underlying issue? Or moments where calm correction actually worked better than anger? Share your experiences in the comments. I read them, and I may respond personally when I can. If this conversation made you rethink how discipline actually works, then like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe for more real world parenting psychology like this.